All right,
All
how's it
right,
going?
good. So I'm going to make one correction from our last talk that
Okay.
I don't feel is super like vital to make, but something that I kind of need to correct on the record. So you asked me a question about the COVID vaccine and whether or not it was practicable. And
Mm.
when you asked me that question, I hadn't really thought in depth about it. I think after I rewatched it, I was kind of started thinking about it. I'm like, of course, you should really get the vaccine. I mean, think about it. If we were still, 2 years ago in the same situation where society was like going through, the COVID, uh, uh, you know, the problems with associated with COVID, as a pandemic, like that's not very, that's not something we want. That's not something I would consider to be practicable to still be in that situation. And I can acknowledge that
Mm.
essentially with the way vaccines work, you need at least like 90% of people to get them in order for the that herd protection to be gained as a species. And so, if so, to correct the record on that, I would say that uh, the COVID vaccine to not get it is not practicable
Mm.
because you are susceptible to disease from COVID and also spreading it to others. And then if 90% of people wouldn't have got it, then obviously we wouldn't be in today's 2023 where COVID's kind of like it's basically not a thing anymore. So
Gotcha.
that that's what I would wanted to correct at first.
Yeah,
But
you wouldn't believe the amount of conversations I have where right when I get done with it, I go, "Wait a minute, there's a clear answer to this. Why didn't I think of this then?"
Yeah, yeah,
So
no,
I know how
and,
you
and
feel.
everybody does it, you don't unless you really like sit down and think about it, which
Yeah.
I didn't for this talk, I didn't even think you were going to ask me anything like that. So you kind of caught me off guard. I just sort of said the
Yeah.
first thing that popped into my head. But
Hmm. Okay.
so where we left off last time, why don't you give me your sort of
Yeah.
contextual feel for where we're at in this conversation?
Okay. Well, I came up with one question I have for you, which is basically what I would base from my perspective of what I want this whole conversation for me to be about is just you helping me understand this one question.
Hmm.
And as far as whatever you have for me, that's great as well.
Okay.
Before I answer that question, I want to not to feed a fed horse, but the thing I want to go over this quick little thing that I've said a couple times. You've probably heard me say in other videos, but I just want to get a quick answer from you. If I went into the forest, I did not need any food. I was full. There's a tree with an apple on it. A deer goes to get the apple. I can shoot the deer, take the apple. Um, this is not vegan or is vegan.
So it sounds like you didn't need the apple,
I
right?
do not need the apple. I won't need it tomorrow. I can see into the future. I will never need it, but I can eat it.
Okay, so I would say what makes it vegan is if we can justify our need for it.
Okay.
Like because like if we get
But
into the
which part
conversation,
makes it not vegan though?
so if you are killing a creature and you're not justified in doing it, like the
Mm.
justification for veganism, why the position already comes built in with the justification is that
Mm.
practicability aspect. So like, if you have a farm where you're growing a ton of apples, and one deer comes into your yard and starts eating your apples, like if it's not going to harm your harvest, then
Mm.
that's not really a problem. Like I
Okay.
wouldn't have a garden in my yard and just suddenly just like shoot you know the deer,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day I don't really need what's in my garden. I could go to the store and get the same thing and it wouldn't really be an uh, it wouldn't be such a burden to do that. And so,
Mm.
it's we shouldn't just recklessly kill animals just because they're eating food too. That to me it
Yeah.
seems like they need it. But
Yeah.
I
Well,
think what this
I
I
wanted
think
to
the point of
challenge
this I think the
the.
point of this question is to get to the crop deaths, right? To
It
kind of
is,
see.
but it also is to get to the point of um, the definition of veganism within the vegan society, because a lot of people, not maybe not a lot, but I know people that say crop deaths, any form of death involving crop deaths, just isn't connected to veganism. And I think the idea is because it's not exploitation or cruelty, which is what's in the vegan definition.
So yeah,
If the deer dies instantly that you're taking the apple from, we can call that not cruelty, depending on how you define cruelty. And then exploitation, you're not using the animal for a means. You're just killing it randomly, and then you're eating the apple, not the animal. So would
well,
you say that it should be at least an unsaid part of veganism to not kill
I
that
would
deer?
say it is cruelty if it's not necessary. Like to me,
Oh, okay.
yeah, to me, if it's not like, say an animal is like you did nothing to harm it, but you can see that, hey, this animal is like severely in pain. It needs to be put out of its misery. It's not cruel to put that animal out of its misery because it's just suffering. It's going to die anyway, right? Like, wouldn't it make sense to say that it would be almost actually cruel if you didn't kill that animal? Because it
Mm-hmm.
would be necessary to end the suffering that would it's already going to lead to death. So you're basically taking out additional suffering out of that equation. And so, in the reverse context, if we're saying, hey, is killing something cruel? I think we still have to ask the question of whether or not it's necessary. Because if it's like a matter of like, and we can bring this down. What I like to do in my head, because we live in a huge society, is I like to bring this down to village politics. I like to say, okay, let's pretend for a second we're in a village here, and I'm the village farmer, and then we have humans from another village that we do not have any relationship to. We can't talk to them. They don't respect us. They want our food. So they come over and they steal our crops, and they do so to such a degree where like we don't have any crops to feed our villagers, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
now it becomes a matter of necessity to protect those crops, and if you have to, you might have to defend them with force. But
Yeah.
ideally, you're trying to not do that. You're trying to do anything to get away from that. And
Mm-hmm.
what's important about this question is the roles that we play as well as individuals, because
Mm-hmm.
me, the consumer going to the grocery store and buying something, is different than the farmer who's going through the harvesting process and actually trying to get a yield out of the land. So like in some of these conversations where I've heard you mention like talking about is it because I think you asked me last time, and I also watched another of your stream where you kind of brought up, hey, well, what if you eat more food than you need, right? So
Yeah.
I wanted to answer that question for you and
That
basically
is
say,
well. I can just say it real quick, just so
go
you
for it. Yep.
hear it. The question I wrote down that I gave that analogy for is it practicable to not be overweight? And I might have said this in our last talk, but that's what I want to. That's a focus for me today. Is it practicable to not be overweight? And I want to throughout this talk, or at least part of this talk, compare that to the idea of somebody's claim of to them it's not practicable to not eat honey. Like to them, their want for the honey um, outweighs what they think of the bee. Would we justify that in a different way if somebody wanted to be overweight but did not need to be? So yeah.
Yep. So the way I am going to look at this question is through the lens of, is overconsumption of any diet a point worthy of moral consideration due to the fact that consuming more is needed to live and causes more death than not doing so, right? Is that
Mm-hmm.
kind of why there is a moral qualm here, is because technically more death is inherent in eating more crops? Is that kind of like
Ooh,
the
yeah,
crux of
I
where this
wouldn't
problem
say
comes
in
from?
any, considering that we could always talk about future ideas. But yeah, like if lab grown meat doesn't cause any crop deaths or animal deaths or harm, then I would say overeating lab grown meat would be more ethical than overeating crop food. And I might even say, separate from being overweight, consuming food that we can safely know is unhealthy, say like a vegan cake, vegan donuts.
Yep.
I don't want to ignore the importance of these things. The importance of those turning people vegan outweighs the removal of this product. But consuming them must be some form of not vegan.
So actually, so I do have the answer to that question.
Yeah.
On one face of this, I would say that we do have a couple criteria to consider in addition to the question you've asked. So most of the time when we're asking questions about well, and this is kind of my moral framework. If you feel like there's something wrong with it, just let me know. But basically, if we can, like, if we have questions regarding ethical behavior as whether or not they're like necessitated and result in a moral qualm, like, hey, eating more plants on a vegan diet, is going to cause more death, aka, from rodenticides, for example, or other, pesticide use or things like that. Well, we have to look at the qualm that that produces to weigh that against what our rights are as individuals, because the way I sort of see it is that when you're pushing a rights-based message, there are certain rights that I would call de facto, meaning they're kind of like found in reality. Like, and for me, that's stuff that's like fulfilling a need. So like, we have a need to survive, we have a need to eat, we have a need to not only those things, but we have a need to like self-advantage ourselves so that way we can protect ourselves from future issues we might have with other people or creatures. We have the right to kind of pursue happiness on some level. We have to fulfill that need. And what we're trying to
Mm-hmm.
do is we're trying to weigh our needs against these moral qualms, so to speak, and basically judge whether or not our needs are justified in consuming more or they're not justified. And so I do think looking at it through the lens of like, hey, we can ask the same question for somebody who consumes, an omnivore diet. They eat animals and they eat plants, right? But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, when we're looking at how many deaths are caused from animal agriculture, and these are deaths that we consider to be worthy of moral consideration, versus deaths that are the result of like a vegan diet that are worthy of moral consideration, like the rodenticide deaths and all these other mammals that do suffer. I don't think bugs necessarily are that important because they while they might some of them might feel pain, they probably don't suffer. They don't have a thought involved process that actually gives them that level of suffering, like that we're taught that level of pain, which is what we call suffering. So that there's two different levels of distress that these beings can feel. So there's already a,
Mm-hmm.
a moral distinction we can make there between bugs and just other animals. But at the same time, you know we could ask the question for a vegan person, and we could ask this question for maybe somebody who's not vegan, and we can see why somebody who's on a vegan diet can still be vegan even though they might overconsume. And I say overconsume because any form of taking in more calories is kind of where more deaths come from. So regardless of whether
Mm-hmm.
that's for fulfilling this like happiness that we need within ourselves because we're eating a vegan donut, or because we're eating more legumes because we want to bodybuild and basically build our body up. Those are
Mm-hmm.
justifications that we then apply to, okay, how many deaths actually happened, because this is the important part. And it's also the comparison of how many deaths versus how many more deaths, because it's not just so much the raw numbers, it's the difference between the two. And so
Yeah.
kind of what's important to me here is to kind of look at, like, what are our best estimates for um, wild animal deaths, including, mice and birds and all of these things. If we take the largest number, that's out there, and we look at this on an annual basis, we'll find that, according to Faunalytics anyway, excuse me, they said that 7.3 billion wild animal lives basically die as a result of crop deaths every year. Now, if you look at that and compare that to the human population, you know that the human population is about 8 billion. So it's basically one wild animal for one person every year. And
Mm-hmm.
that's very easily justifiable to say, oh crap, I mean, I'm definitely worth at least one wild animal, to continue living like that. I would value my
Mm-hmm.
life in a greater amount. And then we ask the question, okay, well, if we are going to say bodybuild, right, or in the other case, eat something for pleasure, kind kind of have like a pursuit of happiness there, or basically fulfill our emotional needs with some sort of, a cheap uh, source of dopamine that, just comes from straight from food, is, and basically has the impact of like helping us get through the day if we're suffering emotionally for whatever reason. It's one of those like crutches, and
Mm.
and in that way, I think we have a right to that to some degree. And so let's just say the average, let's take person A, and person A eats 2,000 calories on average, right? And
Mm-hmm.
person A gets all their food as a necessity. And then we take person B, and person B is trying to, well, it could be either one. It could be bodybuilding, or it could be, and I say bodybuilding, but I mean really any physical activity. Any, like, it could be like, you're going running, and you're running for extended periods of time, and that would help you if you were ever in a situation where you had to run away from something, but
Mm-hmm.
that's going to cause you to eat more calories. That's the important part here, because the physical activity is going to
Mm-hmm.
cause your body to crave more calories. So as a result, you end up eating more calories. And like typically, like I think in the bodybuilding community, if you're new, you might eat 500 more calories that day, because that is supposed to help you build the muscle. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what's the difference between 2,000 calories and 2,500 calories?
Mm.
It's I'll do the math real quick. So how much more is it? Whoops. So it's 1.25 times more, right? So if you
Mm.
kill one animal a year and you're eating, an additional, uh, 500 calories, you've
Mm-hmm.
eaten 1.25 times more calories that year. And as a result, had 1.25 times more deaths. And
Okay.
that's the death we're weighing against, uh, basically whether or not it's justified for an individual to do the bodybuilding stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Also, so there's also a quick important note before I continue. So I'm telling you about the ethics of this discussion, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a different question as to whether or not it's vegan, because uh, what I was trying to point out earlier about roles are important. The consumer who goes to the store and buys the tomato, they're not committing cruelty, even though inherent in that is the death of an animal, right? A death of an animal who did end up eating rodenticide and suffering and dying. Now, the cruelty, the person who played the role in doing the cruelty
Mm-hmm.
would have been the person harvesting the crops. So there's actually a different question here. Well, hold on, I'll explain.
Okay.
Because even though we can say it's the death is inherent, I will at least explain to you why I think the roles matter, right?
Okay.
So, um, so if we look at this through the other lens, and you ask the question, hey, if the farmer decides to uh, generate a greater yield than is necessary, at all, let's just say they just, chop down an extra acre of forest, and, you know, lay out rodenticide, and, have all these crops here, and then all that food ends up going to waste because nobody needs it. Well, then that would be unjustified cruelty, would it not? Because they made a decision to do something to kill a being that had no necessity to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it was necessary, then I would also say that's not cruelty, because it's necessary for us. Like, we're justified in doing that, right? But
Mm-hmm.
if it's a case of like, hey, who's responsible for the deaths of the excess that's being created here? It's not the consumer, right?
Well, unless the consumer consumes in excess.
Well, if the consumer consumes in excess, they're weighing it against a, like, because now we're back to the ethical side of this. Because what I want to point out is that the consumer is not morally culpable for what is inherent in the
Okay.
product,
Well, let me try to
unless that
let me try to
product is by default a cruel product, because it's unjust, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get you, but maybe I'm missing something, and you can help me catch it. Okay, so if we buy meat, then we are putting it in demand. So therefore, even though we're not killing, the killing is our fault. Okay, so if If I sold apples and I went to the forest to get apples, and if I went to get an apple, I brought it back, I sold it. The person bought it, there was no harm in that apple. And then I go to get an apple and there's a deer there, I shoot the deer, I get the apple, I sell it. The people buying it, they don't know if the deer is going to die or not. So it's not necessarily that the purchase entails the deer dying. But what if every time I went to get an apple or a bushel of apples, it turned out that there would always be a deer there, and a deer died every single time. Therefore, the people purchasing it, if they were made aware of this, that purchase entailed the deer dying,
It
would you not
entails it.
say? Would you
It
not say
entails
that
it.
it includes it's similar or almost identical actually to the purchase putting it in demand?
So the reason why I think that it's not identical is because when we're asking ourselves the question about what kind of world do we want to live in, it's ironic, but on some level, we would prefer, and this is maybe just my opinion, but I think on some level, we would prefer a universe where people do the quote unquote right thing, like the right action, the just action, and
Mm-hmm.
in your case that wasn't just because you didn't probably have to kill that deer, unlike in the case of like maybe growing wheat or soy or something and laying out rodenticide, like those that would probably be just because we are able to justify and say, hey, our human lives are and the rights that we have as humans can outweigh these things. But it might be different if that death rate was so much more higher
Mm-hmm.
because of the number of deaths that are inherent. So, like I just gave you the biggest estimate that I could find: 7.3 billion animals, from wild animals. I'm not talking bugs on that number.
The
Wild,
non-insect wild animals,
yeah,
including the animals that probably consume the insects, like birds that
yes,
die from. Okay, yeah.
yep,
Okay,
yep.
so my question to that would be, if somebody were to live off the grid, have their own farm, or not their own farm, but they just had their own garden that they could grow enough food to feed themselves. They could freeze whatever they need to for when winter comes around, and they don't use any pesticides. They don't kill any. They can keep all the wild animals out. They don't kill one a year like others do. Does this give them the right to go and kill one animal per year?
No, because it's the action what is important. And the reason the action is important is because the intention does matter. Like, say for example, let's just use a completely random example. Let's say a bank robber comes into the bank. They drop their gun and they were about to shoot somebody, but they drop their gun. You pick up their gun, you shoot at them, and you do hit them, but then you also kill the person behind them because I don't know, the gun was able to penetrate through their body and into somebody else, and that would be an
Mm-hmm.
accidental death. You definitely didn't intend it, so intentions do matter. We would
Yeah.
rather live in a universe where somebody tried to save us, right? Even though they unintentionally killed somebody else, rather than the bank robber just being the one to do the one killing. You know what I mean? Like, it would
Mm-hmm.
I know you're looking at the consequence like they're the same, but the action is important because,
Yeah.
say, for example, we bring this back to veganism and we ask the question, okay, why is it better that, you know, let's say, for example, instead of farming pigs, we're farming humans, right? Let's just go to that
Mm-hmm.
route, and now we look at this, uh, as an atrocity. Um, and X amount of humans are dying as a result, and they're being exploited. And we know that action is inherently more wrong than them, working and accidentally getting killed in a construction accident. Even though we know
Mm-hmm.
for a
Mm-hmm.
fact that that's probably going to happen, because statistically speaking, people die all the time from construction accidents, and we're never going to get away from that. But we know
Yeah.
that the
Yeah.
act makes a difference. That the act of exploiting a human is so much more of a violation to that person than it would
Mm-hmm.
be if
Mm-hmm.
they just unintentionally died, as a result. And with the rodenticide, we are intentionally putting that out there. But what we're doing is protecting the human species, and we are justified in doing that to the degree that we're doing it in a way where we're respecting sentience, and we're able to consider, how much suffering does this actually cause? Because if we have the choice as a farmer, as a vegan farmer,
Hmm.
we probably shouldn't be using rodenticide. We probably should be using uh, the veganic farming techniques that don't have that sort of impact. And basically, maybe we would get less yield. And then what would happen? And that would we would just have to be okay with that. We would just have to be okay with getting less yield as vegan
Hmm.
farmers. But
Hmm.
basically, if everybody became vegan, eventually we would get to the point where maybe like 33% of all farming would be veganic, but maybe 66%, if we tried to make it vegan, purely veganic, we might not be able to feed everybody. And so we have an impracticable solution. We can't just
Yeah.
do veganic farming 100% if we can't sustain the current population 100%. So we have to be
Hmm.
able to list the actions that are either more just or less just. And in the
Yeah.
case of like, you know, with your question though about whether or not it's ethical to eat more, and
Practicable to be overweight. Yeah.
and because why do people eat just carbs just to or sugars just to have some little bit of pleasure? Well, obviously that our emotional needs need to be satisfied on some level. We're not going to be able to always like you know uh, people go through shit.
That's why people
We
eat
have to.
animals, though.
Well, they do that, but they don't do it in the same scale. So we're talking about like people who so the
It's not the same
animal
scale of
agriculture.
animals dying, but it's the same reason
it's
that.
it's also different. It's also different. It's actually a different reason, right? Because they're literally exploiting the being. So like if it was humans, we'd be like, hey, I understand, you're advantaging yourself, but you actually are not justified in doing that,
Oh, no,
right?
no, I didn't mean the reason within the outcome. I mean the reason for why somebody says, "Oh, I really want a burger right now," or "Oh, I
Yeah,
really want a
it's
vegan
it's
burger right
it's
now."
it's the
It's
same. It's the
that person
same.
the same.
Yeah, that's the same, what I would call the same de facto right. Like you still have that omnivore still has that right, but what we're doing here is we're acknowledging that the act that involves taking sentient beings who are capable of this suffering, probably to great degrees, and
Hmm.
putting them through these situations, these factory farms, just so they can, have that same sort of satisfaction, uh, but they're basically killing, 1,000 times more. I don't know if it's 1,000 times, probably like 300 times more animals doing that, right? Than if they were just vegan. Obviously, we can see both of the act matters, that these beings were exploited because that act is not just. There was no justification for doing that act.
Hmm.
Whereas on the other side, there was a justification. It is justice to do that, to have at least crop agriculture. And because at the end of the day, when you're like the death count of a vegan, if it's one a year,
Hmm.
one mouse, one bird, or whatever, one animal, and then you eat 500 more calories a day, for that entire year, and you create basically 25% more death. Well, you're not even getting to an entire other being, a whole being. You have a quarter of a being on top of this one being, meaning like the scale there is not
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
right is justified, but the
Gotcha.
right
Well,
wouldn't
l-
be justified if that was hundreds and hundreds of beings that we do care about.
gotcha.
I
Yeah,
think at that point,
the number would matter. Yeah, yeah, for
yeah.
sure. No, you're right. Okay, so let's say veganic farming takes over, not takes over, but it blows up. It starts going good. Where do you live? What city?
Iowa.
Iowa. So let's say
Yep.
in Iowa, half the farms are now vegan, that no crop deaths whatsoever, and somehow you can charge the same amount for your food. So the majority of grocery stores, anywhere anybody would go, or at least near where they would go, um, will have options that are listed as these were grown without any crop deaths. And it's all the same price. I think we might have already gone over this with like an apple to an apple, but like at this new example, would you say with that option that the crop death option would be not vegan, or would you just call the vegan option more vegan?
I would say if there's like a actual zero number on it, then it
Hmm.
would be the vegan option. And this is me looking at it from the perspective of, hey, I go to the grocery store. This tomato over here has a little sticker on it that says zero crop deaths. This one over here says, you know, I don't know, uh, typical farming or something like that. I'm able to distinguish that this one over here has crop deaths, this one, doesn't have crop deaths. Then I can say this one's actually the vegan option. Now, if the tomato on the left only has one crop death and the tomato on the right has two crop deaths, then
Hmm.
one is just more vegan than the other. It's not.
More
It's
vegan.
not.
Got it.
Yeah, it's not like a hard line anymore because it's not a clear. It's not a clearly obvious option to have
Okay.
animal free as your product,
Okay.
as your
And then
choice.
in your personal take that you want the apple to always have zero, you would be accepting of yourself eating the one that would cause one or two deaths a year. Well, not that just the apple, but knowing that the produce you eat within a year would cause one or two deaths. But if it got into larger numbers, especially like 1,000 a year or something, or even 100 a year, then you would start to see concern there. So okay, so now here's another example. If at this place there's at the store there's two options of honey, and one of them is honey from like a commercial farm, and one is honey from however you do local organic honey or whatever. And let's say that I've seen these things where bees can make honey, and then you just take little bits of it or whatever. So you take an amount to where it barely affects the bees. And so it's still taking honey. It's maybe even cuts their lifespan down a little bit, where instead of cutting it in half, it just I don't know, they lose like maybe a 20th of their life or something. Um, would it then just be that that honey is more vegan than the other honey?
No, because it's not necessary for us humans to take it from those bees. Like the bees, you just said that they would lose a little bit of lifespan in this scenario, right?
Yeah,
So
less
so what's our
lifespan
what's our
than.
justification to saying that we are just in taking it? Because I
What it
think
would well, what would considering, especially since we've talked about not caring about bugs, because I'm kind of with you on that. Now, there can be some that, due to our current situation, we can care more about. Like we can care about bees and ants based off our knowledge of how they affect the ecosystem. And we might feel different now with the concern that we are running out of bees, where if in a hypothetical 10 years from now, we have an abundance of bees, it might feel different. But considering that we don't care much about bugs, we might have to compare it somewhat to if somebody was putting honey in their tea versus somebody was putting a spoon of sugar in their tea, and the sugar was from sugarcane, but insects died from like pesticide use. Um, it would come down to if we care more about bees than whatever insects, including bees, probably died from the pesticides. But do we need the sugar or the honey for that dopamine hit?
so. Again, I would go back to what the difference in the justification is on the in the act that we are doing. So
Mm-hmm.
let's just take, for example, the honey example, and then compare that to um, farmers basically driving the bees to go and pollinate their crops, right?
Okay.
So in one instance, we are justified in moving those honeybees and their hive to a different farm to basically encourage them to pollinate so that we can survive, right? And in
Yep.
some way, we are exerting or force or control over them, but we know that if we don't, that we're probably not going to have any crops this next year, or basically have zero, and that's going to cause huge problems for humans and cause excessive amounts of suffering. But if you choose not to consume their honey itself, then you know that or I'm sorry, if you do choose to consume their honey, you have to ask, well, why am I justified in taking that from them? Because the act is what's important here. Because on one hand, on the left side, we're saying, hey, we need it for survival, and on the other hand, we're saying, hey, we need it for pleasure. And so the
Let's
pleasure,
just compare it
and
to a.
I'll continue with what you're saying though. I'm gonna bring it back to the pesticides over here. So the pesticides
But just in a sugarcane
justified.
field, can we do just a sugarcane field?
Sure, sure, yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, and we have to understand that, like, um, to some degree, I mean, sugar is not inherently bad for us. Like, we know that overconsumption of sugar might be bad for us, right? It can be, because at some point, over consuming sugar will probably impact, insulin response, and so, like, that,
Can we call it
eventually.
as unnecessary on its own as honey is?
Well, no, I think the honey is more unnecessary, because, like, say in a hypothetical world where you do have veganic farming, right?
Uh
Like,
huh.
you could harvest honeycane. You could eventually get to the point where or I'm sorry, I call it honeycane. This is the sugar cane. You could
Oh
get to the
no, I
point where
don't
the
mean which
sugar.
one's more moral or vegan or any of that. I just mean separately looking at a health aspect. Are either of those more needed than the other, or are either needed at all in an optimal human diet of anyone's opinion? Would either of those things be thought of as necessary on their own?
So this goes back to the question. This is actually the same question as the one with the apple and the deer. Because on one hand, if you go and collect the apple, and you have to, I let's just pretend that this deer is like, it's like a horde of deer that come to your farm, because I'm trying to imagine a situation where you have to justify, shooting the deer, right? So let's
Mm-hmm.
just say it's a bunch of deer. They all come onto your farm. Let's go back to village politics for a second. So or village ethics for a second. So you're in a village. You have to feed the village. The deer, the horde of deer come onto your property. They start eating all of your food, and then you start shooting, and you shoot a couple and they die. Well, that action is totally different than going out into their territory, basically, and hunting
Mm-hmm.
them, killing them, and then bringing them back, and then being
Sure.
like, this is how, because the act itself was not only exploitive, but it was also cruel. You probably didn't need to do that. If you did need to do that, then it was justified. So, that kind of throws that out of the question. But we're asking whether or not we're saying one is necessary, one's not. And in the same way, it's not necessary to take the honey, but it is on some level necessary to get the sugar, because sugar is used in so many, like, foods that we eat. Like, we have to make things more palatable for ourselves. But doing it with honey would be an extra layer of a wrong act, because you're exploiting a being that, even though they may not feel, like, they may not suffer, they still probably on some level are sentient, and we know that we're basically inhibiting them from fulfilling their need to eat that honey. Whereas if we're doing it with sugarcane, we're not inhibiting their need to eat their own honey. They die as a result of, landing on these crops, and we know that the act itself was justified, because if not, then all us humans don't get to live. So on one hand, if we're looking at strictly the acts, we
We
can
get to
see
live
that.
if we're focusing on sugarcane.
Say that again.
Just if we're focusing on the comparison of should we have a sugarcane field to make processed sugar, or should we have a, I don't know how honey is done. I don't know if they just have a setup, and then if bees come, and then once the humans take the honey away, they have to give them something else. But I don't know the process of how the honey is commercially made. But I was just, you said to survive, and so I just want to compare just the honey to the sugar for a second, because we could say insect death to do all the other crops are fine, but if you say that it's not necessary to eat the honey, I just want to say it's not necessary to eat the processed sugar.
I see why you would say that, because honey is a different form of sugar, and then you have sugar on the other hand. But like,
Hmm.
I'm still, it's still true that one act of, one act on the left side, which is harvesting your crops, is justified, and then the other act on the other side of taking the bee's honey is not justified.
And it is
Like,
justified for what reason? The
so
the sugarcane.
the sugar cane is still a food that is we do need in our diet. We still need sugar to survive.
Hmm.
Like it's like, I mean, don't get me wrong, like putting a little bit of sugar in your coffee is not going to contribute to your survival, but like, if you're eating like pretty much like you could be eating really any food and throw in a little bit of sugar as like a baking ingredient, and you're getting those additional calories, right? And so the
Yeah,
calories matter, that
you could
you're
smoke
still going
one
to.
cigarette a year and you're probably not going to be affected negatively because it's so minimal. So that added processed sugar probably won't affect you negatively. But there's no way under any thought whatsoever, other than maybe freely the banana girl, that processed sugar entering your body could have any health benefit, especially compared to any other form of getting natural sugars from natural foods into. And I don't mean
Well, hold on, hold on,
natural.
hold on. Yeah, because that now
I,
we need to drill you on that, because all foods, like fruits, are going to have sugar in them. So
yeah.
you're basically telling me like, we don't need fruits either, right?
No, 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 no. I'm saying we specifically growing the existence of processed sugar, I think is equally comparable to honey. Taking something that has sugar within it is a whole different story. Now, sure, we could break this down to pointing out that back in the day, any of the fruit we have now never existed how we're used to it now, and therefore we could figure out a way to make the fruit naturally grow. It's maybe possible to make hybrids that could be unhealthy. I haven't heard of this, but I would assume anything that grows naturally, other than maybe the maple from how you get maple sugar. It contains various different things that we would call healthy, and if it became something we wouldn't, then we would just add that into comparing it to honey and sugar. I just don't think there's a good argument out there for the necessity of table sugar.
Well, hold on. So let's compare, because would you agree that honey is basically like sugar with a couple more things in it?
Yes, correct.
So, and do you think that the honey as sugar is basically the equivalent to the, refined sugar we might buy from the store?
Yeah, I mean there are added ideas like Contrarian 420 over here is pointing out that even though he is vegan, aside from little bits of honey, that honey is really good to put on burns, and it's better than most medicines that exist out there for putting on burns. But I do want to ignore all that. Just the idea of buying honey to consume the sugar. Yeah, I would consider it practically identical.
So, can we simplify this at least to say sugar one, which would be the honey, and sugar two, which will be the refined sugar? Just
Yes.
to simplify it. Okay, so
Hmm.
now let's say you could get sugar from basically stealing it from a human that makes it from their body, or you
Okay.
can get sugar from a plant. Let's say you have an entire field of sugarcane, right?
Hmm.
Now let's say one human basically from another tribe came over and tried to steal, and was sincerely like kept stealing, kept stealing, kept stealing. You had no choice. You just had to shoot this guy to keep him from basically
And
threatening
they didn't know any
threatening
better.
your. Yeah, yeah, they would basically be like, they would be trying to survive too, like,
Hmm.
but basically there's no way to communicate with them, there's no way to reason with them, there's no other option, is basically the finer point.
Yeah.
So what's more ethical, stealing the sugar from the human, or basically trying to grow and intending to grow sugar cane, and then it happened to be that humans are coming over trying to steal it and the farmer had to shoot it? Which one is more ethical?
They would be both equal depending on the outcome.
What do you mean by the outcome?
Um, the so for a whatever measurement of sugar, led to X amount of insect death. Let's ignore pain for a second. Insect death, and then X amount of honey to for X amount of bee death. It would be when you have the equivalent insect death, whatever amounts you have of honey and sugar are equal.
So it's an equal
Even with
ethical
humans,
question.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
because I think the act is very important because like
Hmm.
when we're trying to determine what is just in society, we can say, for example, hey, we have all these murderers out here and they kill, 1,000 people a year. Let's say
Hmm.
we're in a village, 10,000 people live in this village, 1,000 of them are murderers, and they're going to kill 1,000 more people. So they're going to kill one person. And then let's say on the other hand, you
Hmm.
know, instead of those 1,000 people doing the murdering and killing the 1,000 people, those 1,000 people end up dying from, let's say, the crops went bad and they all got poisoned, they all died, right? Can we
Hmm.
see how the difference in the actions that took place have a relationship to justice and which world we would prefer to live in? Would you not prefer to live in a society where there's a possibility of maybe your food has been it
Yeah,
basically it grew with some
I
poison
got you.
attached to it?
Yeah,
Would you
so
prefer that over a murderer
we'd
killing
want to
you?
look at two different things. So we'd want to look at if something is morally culpable or not. So that's one difference between actions of a human versus actions of an animal. But the other thing I'd want to look at is, do I want to live in a society with someone or something that could intentionally do something wrong without me being able to reason with them? So no, I wouldn't want to live in a society where lions can roam around and I got to cross my fingers they're not going to eat me. I want my society to keep them out. And so same thing with a human that might do something immoral intentionally.
Yep, yep. So there
Yeah.
we are able to look at territorial autonomy in that case. We're
Hmm.
able to look at moral agency in that case. But in the example I gave you, I'm trying to point out that basically a human farmer accidentally, through let's just say some screw up on their part, killed 1,000 people because the food got tainted and was poisonous, salmonella or something on their,
Hmm.
I don't know, on their lettuce or whatever, and then you have over here, 1,000 murderers killing one person each. We
Hmm.
know that the farmer who didn't intend to
Does the farmer
kill.
keep doing it?
I would say that the farmer is intending to do the best they can, but they can only do so much with what they have, right?
But is
Let's
this
just
a
say,
one-off? Is this a one-off accident, or is this a we know this is the outcome and we allow it? Because that's the difference here.
so I would say that yeah, in this case, we're going to ask the question, like, hey, this farmer, the mis I guess I was going with the mistake here. All I was trying to highlight was the action. So
Hmm.
let me bring it in a little closer
Well,
to your question
I just
about.
want to let you know where I stand a little bit, so you can know that I do agree with you in a huge sense. If a tractor is going through tilling up a field to get carrots out from under the ground, I would like to think that the noise would be enough to make most animals run away. If an animal dies in that process, I view that very different from leaving poison out for an animal or spraying crops with pesticides, because I do think the intentions matter. But also, if we do something intentionally and there is a repetitive outcome, I think we have to factor that outcome in based on our intentions. But anyways,
We
go
do
on.
we do have to factor that outcome in, but it's not the same because it's blowback, if that makes sense. So, for example, in a political situation where the president of the United States has to make a decision to drop a bomb on some major terrorist organization, but it's going to kill X amount of people, and we know
Hmm.
for a fact it's going to kill X amount of people, and we know this decision is probably going to come back up in the future again, and we know we're going to have to make that decision again. We know that the action to do it has blowback in it, but we know that that blowback is justified. Does that answer that
Hmm.
question?
I mean, yes, I know what you mean.
So in the case
And
of in the case of
this is why crop deaths in general, based on the number, could be justified. The thing you just gave the example of, it would be the same with the war thing, where the higher the innocent casualties, the more you'd be less likely to do the act. And so we got to see if what we want outweighs the bad, and that's
yep.
perfect. That fits in there, but not when you look at sugarcane versus honey.
I would say it does because it's the same
Hmm.
thing. First of all, one is sugar A, one is sugar B. Minus all the other stuff that maybe for burns or whatever. I don't even know about that. But let's just say the sugar A, sugar B thing. We know that the action to extract sugar A, the honey in this case, requires a violation to the animal's sentience in that we are taking explicitly the first action, the primary action we're doing is explicitly removing something that these animals need that we could get from alternative sources. That alternative
Hmm.
source is obviously B over here. So sugar B comes with bugs that die as a result of the pesticide on the plant. But what you're saying is
Yeah.
that we don't need sugar, and that's not technically true because on some level we need it as a fuel source for our body. So like uh, it is possible to go completely without sugar in your body in the sense that like somebody could do a ketogenic diet and run off of fat, as fuel for their body. Like you could even do a vegan ketogenic diet, and
Hmm.
essentially you won't really be using sugar as your primary fuel source. But that's not typical. Those are and actually the keto diet is a very it's not a common diet at all. Like that's a very rare diet used for kids who have epilepsy essentially, and it did turn into a fad because like it does have some impacts on how your metabolism works, right? My
Hmm.
personal opinion is that ketogenic diets have a really good short term ability to help reset like insulin sensitivity, for example. But long term, these diets are not going to be full of nutrients. But so on a carb diet, which
Can I
is
try?
most people
Can I try to
on
narrow this down in a way to where we don't get into health for this talk? What
Well,
if
the
we
only
were
thing I would say
only?
is that it is necessary because the health part of it
Mhm.
is that we need sugar to burn that sugar to do things like move my hand. Like this requires
Yeah.
me burning sugar. So it's not as simple as like, hey, we don't need it because it's like, I don't know, some piece of plastic on the ground. It's not
Okay.
equivalent to a piece of plastic on the ground that, bugs happen to land on and we sprayed poison on this piece of plastic. It's actually food and we do
Yeah.
need it, but the primary action is what I'm saying matters. So sorry if you wanted
Gotcha.
to
No, you're
comment.
fine. You're fine. I'm trying. I have three different options for how I can take this to try to narrow it down a little further. Um, well, for one, okay, let's imagine a hypothetical world where all crops we figure out how to have no crop deaths, and the only ones we can't figure out would be with sugar. So now we have this world where the whole world's vegan. We can get all these different food products. We'd have to imagine that in this world we couldn't make sugar out of beets or even anything else that has sugar.
Hmm.
We would just have to imagine that you can eat all the food options there are, but you can't create processed sugar without having insect and other wild animal deaths. So that's cool. This is a cool world. And now we still have honey being what it is, and then we have the sugar being what it is. Let's also factor in, even though we didn't really deviate from the consuming the sugar by itself, let's imagine that sugar and honey is only used to put in tea. So the people doing this, they're doing it to put in their tea. Um, and there's all these other different options for food. So I guess what I'm trying to narrow this down to pinpoint is if it is being done for pleasure and there is equal death and equal predicted death for bees and the insects from the sugarcane year after year after year. In some cases, a bee that needs their own honey if they had half their honey removed, maybe they're really badass bees that are like, I'm going to outlive all you and I'm a bee that smokes too. And a lot of them wouldn't, but that on average, we have a predicted harm that will come to the insects in both cases. And in both cases, the what's done is done for pleasure and just for the knowledge of our dopamine levels.
Yep. I would say, now let me repeat your question back to you to make sure I fully understood this. So, like,
Okay.
let's say we're in a society, basically every single vegan food, we can say doesn't have crop deaths except for sugarcane over here. That does have
Mm-hmm.
crop deaths, and we know it's inherent, and we can't do anything about it to get rid of it. Well, if we were that far into the vegan movement where we could actually nail down certain foods that we know for a fact we cannot protect with veganic methods,
Mm-hmm.
um, and let's say we can prove that we don't need it as a calorie requirement type of thing, where like say these calories are excess, they're not needed in the sense of supplying food or food having a secure food supply.
Yeah.
If we can say that those things are factored out, and we're looking as to whether or not it's vegan, we do have to recognize that we are seeking to exclude, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any products that cause cruelty or exploitation, especially if it's like not necessary, right? So
Yeah.
if you're telling me that this sugar cane is not necessary in this hypothetical world, then yes, because because in the hypothetical world, how do you justify getting this when you know that you have to poison the mice, for example? Now,
Mm-hmm.
on some level, we do have a right to the pursuit of happiness as humans, right? We have some like small level there where we can maybe make the argument that it's still um, not practicable, but I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that's true because I think you could probably get the same amount of joy from any other food that wasn't, sugarcane. I think you could
Mm-hmm.
probably get an equal amount of food. So that justification now gets thrown out the window. So do
Gotcha.
you
Yeah.
see? Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
no, and
what I would
I
answer that
completely
with.
agree. And I think that's where all these kind of things line up eventually, something like that, especially when we look into the future of what will be achievable. Um, Gotcha. Okay, so I guess one last thing I want to figure out just on this little topic is I think we seem to align on we don't want to randomly kill insects, but we don't really care too much about insects, like when we're looking at crop deaths and stuff.
Yep.
So it's just kind of interesting that we lean the way we do with honey, and it's probably because this idea that we need the crops and we don't need the honey. But a lot of things comes from crops that we want that we don't need, like all the cakes and all that kind of stuff. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out if when we count the wild animals that die from crop deaths, and you've done the math, and it's a little over one per person per year, which is a small number. How bad do we view honey? Considering that we don't count however many insects there are. I don't know. Would that number of insects for the crop deaths ever reach a level where you would go, well, damn, I guess honey's just kind of equal in the mix, and it's not a non-vegan product anymore? Does that number ever affect it?
Uh, I would say, if we still have alternatives, then sorry. So like it sounds like are you still talking about in the case of the sugar cane, or are you just talking
No,
crop
now
deaths in general?
I'm just talking in general. So like if to for the humans that want to consume honey, if they consume honey and a thousand, let's say 100,000 bees die a year because of consuming their honey, and then we say like 50 trillion insects, including some bees, die a year from insecticides or pesticides. I don't know if there's a
Hmm.
difference between those two things. Or if we're just looking person to person, how many bees I guess I'm just getting to the point where like so I have zero interest in consuming honey, but I'm just trying to make it work logically, and I can't seem to other than the not needing of honey.
So when we take honey from bees, the problem with exploitation, as far as it's not necessary for us to take it, the reason why it's wrong is because we can't justify it. We can't say we're doing justice by taking that honey. It's not, the act itself is a primary example of us exerting control or force over a situation to gain a benefit, and the other party in this loses. And we know that for ourselves, if that happened to us, we would be kind of like, man, this is stupid that I have a need to fulfill here. And
Yeah.
bugs can still recognize their need to fulfill these things. They're still like maybe probably
Hmm.
sentient on that level where they can say, hey, I need to go get this food and bring it back to, my tribe, my bug tribe. But they're not going to suffer in the same way that an animal does, because their overall mental faculties are just not there to cause that level of distress to them. So they don't
Hmm.
have the same moral imperative. Even though they are sentient, they don't have that same suffering capability, because one thing to notice, the difference between pain and suffering is that one is more thought involved. So suffering is thought involved.
Hmm.
It's a different type of distress than what is just purely pain. So I think bugs can feel pain, and they know like, oh shit, I need to, you know, something's stepping on my leg right now. This hurts. I need to get away from it.
Hmm.
But they don't suffer mentally. Like say they don't have they're missing a leg. They're not going to start thinking about, oh, I look different than all these other bugs, and I'm just like, they're not going to have this like crisis where they feel certain emotions. There's no,
Hmm.
that level of suffering is not present there for them. So on one level, we can justifiably say that taking the lives of those bugs for our survival is more justified than trying to take the lives of the animals who do suffer, right? So on that's on one side of the scale. And then on the other side of the scale, what we're weighing that against is we're saying, okay, we have this action here that we know is a primary wrong, that the action itself is not justified. So one side is justified, the other side is not justified. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Um, yeah, loosely, yes. No, no, it makes sense. I loosely agree. Um, I'm trying to factor, and we kind of talked about this a little bit last time, but I guess I want to bring it back to it a little bit. But we talked about if it matters that they make it themselves. So let's imagine potatoes. Um, well, I mean, all plants make themselves. We just figure out ways to do it more efficiently. But imagine if instead of farming the way we do, like potatoes start growing, carrots start growing, all these different things start growing. We want that stuff. We didn't plant it or whatever, but we want it. We want to survive, so we go and we not only do we want to survive, we want pleasure. So we go and we spray these crops, and then an insect that also might want it shows up, and because the spray, they die. We get the pleasure, we get the survival. Um, so I guess so. Like if a bee is making its own honey, and let's leave out commercial bee farming, a bee is just making its own honey. We can spot where that honey is at. The bees take off, they come back, they make honey, and then we go, okay, yeah, this crop's kind of how I like that potato over there. We spray it with the insecticide. The bee comes back to their honey area, and oh, okay, they're dead. And then we take that, and we get our pleasure, we get our survival, we get all this stuff. The only difference there, especially when you remove the farm factory, however we do honey normally, the only difference there is that the bee created the honey itself, and in my mind, that clearly can't be the reason to care. um,
Well, wouldn't you care? Like if you made honey
mhm.
and some other human stole it from you?
Well, true, but we are choosing to kill insects for our food. for the
We're
potatoes or whatever. So
right.
yes,
So
if something was doing the same thing to me and they were justified because they don't want to kill a human, but they need to survive. If I was growing something or whatever, they might justify eating whatever I created. If I make a baby, they might justify pushing me away, taking my baby, and going eating it or whatever. I'm not saying it's moral, but we're also trying to justify a moral act of killing the insects in the crops.
okay, so sorry. When we talked about this earlier, though, didn't we kind of specify that there was a necessity on one side and not a necessity on the other? Wouldn't that still play a role in this question?
Which
Or did
necessity?
I? When I say necessity, I mean like, growing crops is necessitated by feeding the population. Stealing honey is really just a purely not a necessity because you're the primary act of getting it, is already taking it away from these beings over here who would normally have this honey, but we're just taking it from them and taking away from them. Isn't that act
Hmm.
not justifiable? In other words, not necessary. But the other act on the other end, where we have to grow the crops, I mean, that is necessary because we're trying to feed the whole
I think they're
population.
both they're both equally necessary.
Why
Yeah.
would the taking the honey be necessary?
Well,
So
I don't think it's necessary in the same way that I don't think we need to eat vegan donuts. But in the allowing of eating unhealthy food or unnecessary food within veganism for saying that pleasure is good, then I think they're both equally necessary. I think they must be.
Well, like I was trying to say earlier about like what kind of world we would want to live in, we have to look at the acts that we as humans do, and we can always look at what the consequence of that act is, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily want to live in that world just because the consequence is better. So like when I was trying to bring it down to the village politics situation and saying about like, you have, these murderers over here, and then you have humans who are, let's just say, they're trying to steal your crops, and so you have to shoot them. Like, can't you see how the murderers, that act is so much more nefarious and so much more of a violation
Hmm.
than it is if, on the other hand, you have to protect these crops to feed the village. From and the humans on both
Correct.
sides. Humans have died on both sides. So like you can look at the act and just by the act itself say that that has a certain fundamental violation that has an extreme amount of consideration because we prefer to live in a world where
Hmm.
we have justice. So we would even
Yeah.
so even if murderers killed less people, we would probably still prefer to live in the world where murderers aren't a thing
Right.
because we know the action is preferable. And so
Yeah. If
because
I
it's
if I if I
preferable.
was if I needed food to survive and there was a animal about to eat an apple or broccoli or whatever, and I shoot that animal and eat that, I think that is a way less immoral act than if I'm full and there's a piece of cake that won't even be healthy for me at all, and animal's about to eat that, and I kill that animal to eat the cake. Yeah, I think the reasoning is very important, which is why I'm only comparing the honey to like sugar because I think it's reasonable to look at this idea of overeating, eating for pleasure alone, and these other various things.
So like with that aspect, so we're still concerned about the bugs in this conversation, right? Or have we moved past
Well, I am
the
thrown
wild
off a
animals?
little bit by the idea that you aren't concerned about bugs at all, except for
It's not at
bees.
all. It's
Or
not
no,
at
sorry,
all.
not at all. You
Yeah,
wouldn't kill them
it's
just for
not.
fun, but
What I, what
you view bees differently.
the whole point of that moral distinction there was to basically make the case that like a vegan who is eating food and it kills a bug is less imperative than a meat eater who just straight up kills the animal and farms these animals. That there's less of an imperative there because the bug doesn't suffer like that deer or the cow or the chicken or the
Hmm.
pig does. There's a great distinction there. So even though I do morally consider the bees, I don't necessarily give them the same level of moral imperative through
Yeah.
which we have to act on. And so, and like I said at the beginning of this conversation, what we're doing is we're weighing our the rights we do have as humans against the moral weight that the beings themselves have. So, like, um, if the pleasure that we're seeking comes from a source where that pleasure was obtained by, stealing it from the being who would have eaten it themselves, as opposed to the source where that sugar cane, where that bee would have died because there was pesticide sprayed on it.
Hmm.
We know that the source that is the sugar cane, we're going to get that pleasure over there, and we're going to prefer that the bee um, actually, you know, we do want to give these animals a chance. So it's not like we're not morally considering them, because at the same time, the definition of veganism does involve the environment, right? Because and that's why I said at the very beginning of all this, what the environment does matter, because we have like territorial autonomy for us, and then we have to give these animals their territorial autonomy as well. So like
Hmm.
they get to, um, you know, it's not just going to be crops all the time that they're landing on. These bees, they land on flowers and other things too that are just
Hmm.
naturally in the environment. And so when you've kind of drawn these lines as to what's mine and what's theirs, and you realize that, hey, we're not able to communicate with them, but we do have to feed the species. Like, we can just look at the act purely and go, hey, even though the consequence on where the bee ended up dying, to us, we would maybe normally consider that to be worse. We do know that the act over here on the right side, the exploitation, was what we were morally culpable for, right? Because you're
Hmm.
not morally culpable for something if you can justify the action, and it has to be a
Hmm.
substantial justification that nobody can really argue with you on, and
Yeah.
that's what makes it. That's why.
And
That's
do you
why
think pleasure is a good enough argument? Do you think
I
if
think.
somebody is a couple 100 pounds overweight and they're eating something that is well known by any metric of whole food, vegan diet, carnivore diet, paleo, keto, every diet thought of says don't eat processed junk food, don't eat cakes, cookies, donuts, these kind of things. Somebody that's a couple 100 pounds overweight eating that just for the taste pleasure, is there an emotional taste pleasure need that could outweigh the death of something?
I would say probably, because the way I look at it is, if you kind of, when we were talking earlier about weighing these diets amongst each other separately, if you
Hmm.
are let's say you're just a carnivore dieter and you only eat animals, and you want to eat more bacon for taste pleasure, and as a result, 10 more pigs die that year. To me, like, that does not, your desire for taste pleasure does not outweigh that animal's suffering they had to go through, and so since that suffering was to that degree, it's not justified. But as soon as you get into the
Hmm.
point where we're talking about, like, these bugs died, we know that they didn't actually like suffer. We just know that they have some sort of like sentience and are trying to survive, but we know that they're like not having these thought involved like levels of like distress, and
Hmm.
we know that that type of distress is so much more impactful to a sentient being, because like I can get a paper cut and that doesn't do crap as far as making me not want to live. But as soon as I say, like, I lose my entire arm, and I'm say I don't feel the pain anymore, I can still suffer, and that would be still excruciating, as far as levels of distress go.
Hmm.
So
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 then you should
the
be able to eat the honey.
no, the primary act is wrong,
The primary
because
actors.
but the primary act of eating the sugar cane is justified.
But you're
It's
saying all
justified.
the acts are wrong, but one is justified?
Yes, because what we're saying here is that the level of suffering entailed in sugarcane compared to somebody who's using you know self pleasure, the right to self pleasure, as like an excuse to cause suffering to a pig. Like those are two different moral distinctions. So depending on the diet, I think you can substantiate one way or the other. And because one wild animal will die per year for your regular amount of food, if you decide to eat, an additional $500, 500 calories of donut per day
Hmm.
for taste pleasure, and the result is that a quarter of an animal more was killed that year. To me, your right to self pleasure is important enough that it's justified, because we as humans have these deeply intrinsic lives that we do on some level need to, not allow ourselves to suffer to such great immenses by restricting, something as simple as like a tasty food. Like we know that tasty
Well, we're
food.
probably suffering more by giving in to this desire of the pleasure of the tasty food overall. But it's complicated, and I don't know if anybody should be forced to be healthy. But when
But
it
does that answer
comes,
make sense to you though?
it does and doesn't. I don't agree with, like in my mind it comes down to the intent of the victim as well. So I get that you're saying the actions we do towards the bees are different from the actions we do towards the insects with pesticides. I do see the difference, but to them it's the same. To them, the bee is living its life and making honey, and that's just what it does. To the insects that are in the fields, they're living their life. They do what they do. And, they want to land on stuff. They want to eat stuff. They want to do whatever they do. And we decide to either cause them suffering or pain or end their lives to consume a product. I get the idea. I agree. In some cases, there is an importance to look at the intent and how the intent's done. In both cases, there's intent here. We intend to kill all the pests that want to come to the crops. But yes, it is slightly different because in one you're doing the direct action, where in one you're causing the action to happen in the near future. It doesn't have to happen in front of your face. But to the insects, it's identical, and they don't know any better. And so I just don't think it's a fair justification. You either have to be accepting of the sugar and the honey or not accepting of either, I think.
Well, like I
But we
said
could leave it here
before,
too, so yeah.
yeah, and I'll just one more time kind of point out what my point on that was, because like, you can have a murderer who kills a human, or you can have a human who tries to steal a crop and gets shot. And we know that we would prefer to live in the world where, like, if I'm gonna get shot by somebody, it's gonna be because I tried to steal their food and they couldn't do any diplomacy with me.
Hmm.
I would definitely prefer that world over the one where the murderer came and killed me just for fun or for food. Like, you see what I'm saying?
Hmm.
That's why I think justice, as far as like what act is justified and what act is not justified, is important, and why I think vegans have made that distinction.
Well, I think it changes with your abilities. And we could try to go over that again really quick. So with humans, it's clear why that matters. Um, maybe not the going into stealing the food. Um, I guess I need a hypothetical painted out where I can factor it in with the rationalizing.
Okay, let's say we have hold on. Does it matter that it's a human, or I'm trying to let me understand that
That
first.
seems to be the. I think we can make it work, but that seems to be the biggest issue with humans is we can make choices. The reason why you can't compare a human accidentally dying who works in a crop field to accidental crop death is because that human can know the risk and they take the risk. The animal dying in a crop, shooting a random rat right in front of me, or letting a rat go and eat rat poison, they are slightly different. But in
They
both
they
cases,
they may
there
not
is.
be aware of like the fact that what they're eating is going to poison them, but they also they are aware that they could die because, you know, when they're out there trying to get food, like they have birds and stuff trying to, you know, they know there's predators out there that will
Mhm.
just eat them. And the other thing is too, like, I mean, at one point, you know, humans probably could have said to be in that situation with nature because like we didn't know what kind of foods were edible, and eventually like we ate poisonous plants. But what I actually, let me bring this to a hypothetical where and maybe let's do one with humans and let's do one where we do it with rats. So let's say a farmer is the murderer. This farmer goes, he'll kill one person a year, right?
Okay.
Willingly. Then this same farmer who is protecting his land or her land is aware that people are coming onto their property and that they don't speak the same language. Let's say they ran into them before. You know, they don't speak the same language. They know that these humans are just trying to survive. That, you know, they're coming over here to steal the crops so they can bring it back to their tribe that lives, you know, miles away and feed their families over there. And so the
Mhm.
farmer goes, stands out in his field one day with his shotgun, and then finds the human who's been stealing his food because he's seen him before, and then shoots him intentionally, trying to kill this guy. Wouldn't
Mhm.
that act have been significantly different from the act of that farmer just randomly, you know, for no reason going and killing, you know, a different person over here?
And do we assume that the different person over here, they're are they killing them for no reason, or are they like going to their house, killing them to take some of their stuff
Uh, I mean, I was gonna just keep it at, you
for
know,
no
just
reason? Okay.
yeah, for no reason, to kill, you know. Um,
Because like for I wouldn't say that even if I'm accepting of killing insects in the crop deaths, that I'm accepting of killing bees just for fun. But I would assume that honey must be something like eating something like table sugar.
And the
Um,
distinction here is that one's necessitated and one's not, right? One, the
mhm.
farmer was like, "Hey, I need to feed, you know, this village where all these people." This guy's a
Yeah.
murderer, but he does care about the rest of the other
Yeah,
people for
so
whatever reason.
so he so
So
killing the innocent one, I think to make it analogous so I can answer it, would have to involve the random innocent one. The farmer is going to take something from that person to also sell to the people that he would sell his crops to.
sorry, I missed your answer. Can
So
you
to
say that
make
again?
him more like the bee, so the farmer kills a random innocent person and then kills a person that doesn't speak English that's about to steal his crops. The random innocent person, I think the farmer needs to kill that person to take a product from that person to also sell to his customers of his farm. To compare it to the bee.
Okay. I'm only starting with the humans because I want to get a baseline for
Yeah.
what we think the action.
Oh, I see.
How,
100% no. Then yes, the if you're going to kill two people and one has a reason and the other does not, then the reason is better than no reason. Correct.
okay. Okay, now before we get to the bees, let's go to the mice. So,
Okay.
same thing, the farmer can kill the mice, right? Or the farmer can like kill, and basically when I say kill the mice, I mean like let's say this farmer breeds mice for fun and kills them, right?
Okay.
Versus
Yep.
the other act over here, laying out rodenticide to kill the uh, mice that are coming into the field to eat the crops. Would the act of killing the mice just for fun, you know, not
Hmm.
justified, would that one be worse?
Yeah. If we equalize the suffering and the death, then yes. Because yeah, we don't need to get into how long it takes a rat to die from rodenticides or whatever.
Yep.
But yes, if they're equal, then yes. 100%. It would be better to have killed a rat to save your food than to have killed a rat just for fun that you bred into existence, whether you bred it or not. Actually.
Okay. So now let's say the same farmer has both a honeybee
Hmm.
farm uh, and then that has a sugarcane farm. And
Okay.
let's say this farmer um, grows all these sugar canes, right? And I don't know, let's say 100 bees die
Okay.
from an entire years of harvest that then goes to feed basically the human population. Um,
The
now,
human population of
oh, sorry, so
sugarcane.
of the village, yeah. So
Okay.
like Yeah, so we're still village
But
ethics
it's
here.
still,
So
it was sugarcane, you said?
yes, sugarcane.
Okay.
Yep.
Sugarcane
So
village, got it.
so they use the sugarcane in baking to make products for in their shops and whatnot.
Yeah.
Um, put it in their pastas or rices or whatever. Add some
Hmm.
calories, and then we have honey on the other side, and basically, um, if we're going to look at which one is more ethical, to strictly just take the honey or strictly just farm the sugarcane, it sounds
Hmm.
to me that you're more worried about the sugarcane because the bees are dying. And on the other hand, over here, the bees are uh, basically just being exploited. And so it sounds to me like you have more of a problem with the bees dying.
Mm-mm. Oh no, I care way more about suffering than I do about dying. But yeah, if we
Well,
equalize it the
well, the
same way,
suffering. Do you think that they suffer? Because that was my
ooh,
distinction for why I think that insects are less morally relevant in the conversation about what's justified and not justified.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but that's why I want to equalize it, kind of like we did with the rats. If we assume they're going to suffer and die the same, like not outweighing like what kind of torture he's doing to the mice he raises versus how much suffering it is to eat rodenticide. If we equalize it, if we say the exact same amount of bees are dying from the honey and if they suffer and have pain, it's the exact same amount, so it doesn't matter as the sugar cane. Then I call it
Oh,
identical. I
you
don't
call it
so
identical. Okay.
identical. Yeah.
And the reason I would say it's not identical, and we can probably just end it at this, but
Hmm.
that the act of taking it from the bees necessarily impairs their ability to uh, provide for themselves, provide for their colony. Basically, essentially, they have a need to fulfill themselves with producing honey, or
Mm.
they need to fulfill the needs of the hive by producing
Yeah.
honey, so that they can continue to live.
Yeah.
Whereas
That's
on the
why
other
I'm.
hand, they died because they went out to go and attempt to help their hive, but they died as a result of pesticide. And we also don't know that they wouldn't have died from, some other bird or something trying to eat it. I don't,
Yeah. So for
whatever the
this.
predator is for bees, I guess.
Yeah. Well, something potentially dying in a predator situation, I don't think allows a future act. Um, which is why I think it's a silly argument in like crop deaths to say there might have been more harm with wildlife before the crop land. I don't know if you're in favor of that argument or not, but it's a horrible argument. I cannot believe Avi.
You're saying making it so that there's more land as opposed to doing the pesticide use. Is
Well,
that what you mean?
the idea that crop deaths at all could be justified by the fact that before turning that land into crop land, that the wildlife potential that could have been there would have involved more suffering. I just think that argument's very silly. And if you don't
But
think
it is
so,
it is technically an opportunity cost, is it not? Because we, on one hand, are forcing our hand over this piece of land where it is very much possible, even likely, that more suffering, really, as a
mhm,
consequence of us not interfering, would have happened because more bugs would have been, you
gotcha.
know,
Yeah.
basically breeding, and then even more
Oh,
easily, the predators and all this stuff would have been there to eat them. More
yeah.
life would have been there in general. So therefore, more animals probably, or sorry, more insects probably would have suffered in this case. But so I
Mhm.
do think the opportunity cost does has to be taken into account because us putting that farm there, even though it does still mean that insects will die, we don't know that those insects wouldn't have died already. Isn't that
Yeah.
true?
No, we don't know that they wouldn't have died already. I would claim that it very much can't matter. But I'll tell you why in just one sec. Before I get to that, I wanna say that with the bee thing, I think to equalize it, because I don't know, you might be right about what happens to the bees mentally after the honey is stolen. To equalize it, I think we should kill them the same way that the insects are killed in pesticides. So the pesticides are on the sugarcane, and the pests come and they die. the bees make the honey, and let's just say that the whatever kills insects with pesticides kills the bees right away, and we take the honey. So
Well, we
I
could
like
even
to
say, I
equalize
mean,
those.
we can equalize those. I think the fact that they're going to die anyway, and we took away their territorial autonomy. We basically, well, actually, we took away their bodily autonomy. We moved their bodies right to
Mm-hmm.
where we want them to be, so that way we could extract, something from them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they may not be dying per se, but eventually they're still going to die. It's still the same consequence. Except that one was an early death, I suppose, because
Mm-hmm.
they ate the pesticide, and on the other hand, it's an entire life of basically not having any bodily autonomy, you know.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how the honey process works. So for the hypothetical, I was hoping to imagine that this was an area where you set something up, and that because I know a lot of people have like backyard bee situation where you set something up, the bees come to it, they make the honey. I'm not saying that this is right, but I'm saying just for the sake of comparison, it might be best to say that the bees voluntarily go there, or at least wherever they make the honey, you go to them. We can leave out the part of ripping wings off of the queen bees and having the bees be driven to different areas. It's just the idea of if the fact that they made it themselves for themselves affects it more than the other. But I think they're equal. I think they're practically completely equal, but we can leave it there. And I am very fascinated to go over. I very badly want to debunk this horrible idea that Dr. Avi, Lifting Vegan Logic, Vegan Gains, and many people have, and you have for at least 5 minutes. I think you're gonna not have it anymore, and you're gonna start sharing with others that you don't have this anymore. But this idea that the cropland um, having less, potentially less suffering than the land before it. So here's the thing. If you think that it is fine to do predator culling, essentially, if you think because some harm might happen to animals in the wild, therefore it is best to prevent that harm by, let's say, taking out the predators in this harmful situation, or even taking everything out. So you take this entire piece of land that you would turn into cropland, and you just end that. You just take that land, the land's bare. You haven't made the crops yet. You just made it. This is where the crops will be. You could go, the amount of suffering that was going to happen there isn't going to happen anymore. So good job. Okay, thumbs up. It doesn't happen. But then at that point, to create an unneeded situation. Now, I'm not saying it's unneeded. We might need crops, but it's not needed because there was potentially other harm that was going to happen with wildlife
Yeah,
there.
I'm
It's
not, and
needed
I'm not,
separately.
I'm not suggesting that we should just make more farmland to stop predators from, killing themselves. I would only be in favor of more farmland if it meant it was a necessity. So I feel like that's probably an
But then it would
important
only be
distinction,
based
right?
on but then it would only be based on the necessity. It would have no connection to what would have happened in the wildlife. Because if what would have happened in the wildlife
Yeah,
should be
but
stopped, then it's just
if your
separate.
if your rebuttal is to the point that pesticides are, or sorry, if I'm telling you that pesticides are justified, and all I'm doing is saying, in addition to the fact that they're justified, if we actually compare the consequence of us doing this to what the opportunity cost was before, we actually see that fewer lives were lost as a result. And so,
Hmm.
just purely looking at it from the consequentialist point of view, we
Hmm.
can see that we definitely still saved some, even though our action had nothing to do with what was right or wrong. Well, it did in this case. It was right because it was justified. But what I'm saying is that you still get to collect on that consequence and say,
Mm.
hey, the fact that we prevented these deaths over here kind of negates the fact that you would say that we are us, by justifying spraying pesticides, have killed them. Like,
Hmm.
we can still say, like, well, consequentially us doing that killed less than what would have been the result of those deaths. the death count,
You
right?
can say it, but I don't think it would justify it in any form, in
I'm saying
any
it's already
possible form.
justified. I'm saying it's already justified. I'm not saying that is the justification. I'm just saying that has an effect on how we look at these numbers. So like
No.
if you're if the point you're drawing to uh to the focus here is that bees and other insects died as a result of this pesticide use, even though we know it was justified because we needed it, I can still turn around and basically rebut that with the fact that, hey, they were probably going to die anyway. No additional deaths occurred as a result of us doing it. That's what I'm suggesting.
I hear what you're suggesting, but explain how it wouldn't look something like this. If um if I took an area that I was going to make cropland, but instead, and let's say there were foxes and chickens on this land, and I killed all the foxes, and it's not justified. It's not justified to make this land, but what's justified is that I'm going to use the land to make something that's going to be consumed. And now these chickens, I let them keep breeding, and I humanely kill them, and then I sell them off to people. They're not going to die the painful deaths that we can recognize by watching wildlife situations where the foxes make them suffer. I'm going to make them die way quicker than that, and because they would have died anyways, I can keep breeding them and keep selling them off.
Yeah. So it sounds like now let me repeat this back to you again. Make sure I got it. So it sounds like somebody who is saying that, hey, these foxes, somebody trying to use it as a justification to kill foxes, right, to breed them, and put this land out here and be like, okay, I'm going to confine them to this piece of land, and then I'm going to breed and exploit and kill them, and then basically they try to justify that by saying, oh yeah, those foxes would have died anyway, right?
The foxes
Like,
would have killed the chicken. The chickens would have died anyways. Yeah.
oh, okay, they're breeding chickens. Okay, so you're
So,
saying they're
so in
killing
the in the
they're
natural
killing the
wildlife,
foxes.
the chickens would have died anyways, similar to the bugs that died in crop deaths would have died anyways. It's just that you killed the foxes, and so
Yep.
now, yeah, the chickens would have died anyways.
And then I think this circles back to our question about what is our preference on the action that is occurring? Is it justice or is it not justice? Right? Wouldn't
Mhm.
this be back to the question on, hey, because like
In
what I
the
was suggesting is that the justification for us growing crops is the necessity that we have to
yeah
feed the human population. But that's the justification. That justification doesn't go away all of a sudden. But
yeah
if somebody's trying to justify killing these other beings because they basically say, hold on, let me make sure I got this. So you're saying that they're killing the foxes that are trying to kill their chickens?
Nope. In the
Nope.
wild, chickens lived here and foxes
Okay.
lived here, and then
Okay.
and instead of making land for cropland, you kill the foxes, fence the chickens in, and when you kill them, you say, "Oh, they were going to die anyways." The
Okay, yeah.
wildlife would have been
So
worse.
so that wouldn't have been a justification because the act of what they're doing, the the act of taking somebody's life, and this is the chicken's life, is still, you can't suddenly say like, oh yeah, they're gonna die anyway because
Hmm.
you breed those chickens, right? These
You
aren't
just let them
wild
breed.
chickens.
You fence them in. You just let them breed.
Yeah. So like in the wild, like, I mean, maybe we need to use an animal that's naturally in the wild for this right
It could be a
scenario to
wild
apply.
type chicken, a fowl. What are they called? Fowl
Let's
or
just
something like
yeah,
that.
let's say you collected these chickens from the wild, you brought them in, you put them in this fenced in area, right? And then you kill them for food versus the fox just killing them in general.
Well, can we
On one
leave that part
hand,
out? Can you just fence in the wild? You don't have to get them from the wild. You just took a piece of land that naturally was wild. You were thinking about stripping it and making crops, and instead you go, actually, let's just kill off these foxes, which this act's bad, but anything past the fox death is just chickens there breeding and whatnot without a predator around. So chickens are just breeding, and then you go in, and the only harm that happens to the chicken is a quick death to that chicken.
But this doesn't this suggest that isn't your question trying to point to the fact that um, when we go to kill these chickens, these people are justifying the death of the chicken because the fox would have killed them anyway. But in
Yeah, just like the
reality,
crop death.
the only reason those chickens were put into this process, because like let's say that's one important question here. This is the same question that I already kind of mentioned earlier about whether or not it's necessary. Is are they breeding these chickens because they have no other options?
No,
Like they can't.
I'm making it as equal as possible to the insects and crop deaths. So
So
the chickens just exist there the same way the bugs exist there, and the people they want to eat the chickens, and so they're gonna kill the chickens. And
okay,
the
so
people want to eat the crops, so they're gonna kill the insects. Yeah.
okay, so this would be like the same thing as like somebody being like, "Hey, I'm gonna go into the wild and hunt this bunny, and kill this bunny and eat this bunny," and basically pointing at the fact that the fox would have eaten the bunny if they didn't do it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah.
Is that similar enough?
That
Is
it's
that even
almost the only the element of what's wrong is similar enough. My main point is the action that takes place afterwards. You can't look at the past to justify it. I don't think anything that's done like this would have been, or the past, or a hypothetical. If I didn't come here, like you could have an entire country that has no humans and just wild animals and whatnot, and
yeah
you can go there and say, I can tell. I looked. We had a camera above before we came here. We saw exactly what happened. I'm going to come and do bad acts as long as my bad acts are something I need to survive and are better acts than what the wild did. It's either good
right
or it's bad, and the
yep
wild doesn't affect it.
yep and I'm not saying it is a justification, even though some of these other guys maybe will try to use it as a justification. I don't think that is a justification. The justification is the necessity to eat those crops,
Yeah.
or in this case the chickens if it's a necessity, or the bunny if it's a necessity, right? You
Mm-hmm.
don't just point to the fact that they would have died anyway as your justification, right? Because we already know they were going to die in one way or another.
Yeah.
So
Would you? Okay.
but
So you would
the
not use
point
that as
of this,
justification.
it's not a justification, but it is a rebuttal to the fact that if somebody is trying to put that death on you, like as though it's your fault, you know
Mm-hmm.
that it already was going to happen, that they were
No,
already going to die.
that can't be
Because
fair though, because if I go save somebody's life that's about to be killed, and then I bring them to my house and I'm like, I'm going to keep you here a month and then kill you, like the act of somebody dying because they would have died anyways, you are doing something wrong if you are doing that act.
the if not if it's justified, right? Didn't we agree
No, no,
that
no.
if it's justified?
If it's justified, it's fine. But if it's justified, it's only fine because it's justified.
Right. But
The
if
other
somebody
part just
tells,
does
but
not
if
matter.
well, if somebody is saying that the result of that death
Mm-hmm.
is something that is a moral like point, like you're trying to use this to morally say, hey, you're wrong in doing this, but
Mm-hmm.
those deaths would have happened already anyway. How did that have any weight to say against my position, that it was immoral? Because isn't that the
Because
whole
if
point of
something's going to
bringing up
happen,
those deaths?
no, if something's going to happen anyways, it does not affect it. If you justify
Right.
something because you have to do it, that is fine. If I go to an island, if I'm stuck on an island and I have to eat a chicken to survive, that is justified in my mind. I justified at least. I will eat that chicken to survive. It doesn't matter to me if something else would have eaten that chicken or not. Um,
Right,
it
but if somebody turns around and says to you, "Hey, you are morally culpable for killing that chicken," you
Yep.
didn't have to kill that chicken,
Uh huh.
to survive.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be fair for you to say, "Well, first of all, I did have to do this to survive, and second of all, I know that that chicken was going to be eaten by another predator on the island because there's other predators on this island, and the fact that you're
That's
holding this death against me is actually irrelevant." It's
That second of all
the
only
irrelevance.
works if you accept in the wild going out to shoot an animal in the wild to eat it, a
So,
prey
but
animal.
if you're like if you're doing this with a bunny because you have to hunt the bunny because you have, let's say we're in an apocalyptic scenario, there's no grocery stores or anything, you have to take the one you have to go and hunt the bunny, and you kill the bunny, and then somebody's like, well, now you're morally culpable for killing the bunny even though you are justified in doing it. Can't you say to them, well, I know that bunny was going to get killed by another predator,
Hmm.
that predator was going to eat this bunny, or I could have eaten it, and I know that I have this desire to live, and I know that desire to live justifies my ability to kill it, but at the same time your criticism is unfounded, because we already know that your criticism, the fact that you're saying that this bunny would have died and I already justified it, and then you're still saying that, like, hey, that death still matters. Well, now I can turn around and say, well, actually the death doesn't matter, because not only was I justified, but the fox that would have killed the bunny was also justified to live. And the justification basically tells you, like, hey, no more deaths actually occurred here, because the right action in that case, your survival, prioritizing your own survival, was the right act. But the death that they're using against you to counter that would have already happened anyway. I just don't see how that would have been
Hmm.
relevant as a rebuttal. Do you see what I'm saying? It's not. It's
No,
my contention is not so much that it is a justification. It's that the counter to the justification has a rebuttal within it, which is that they would have died from another predator, right?
I, I, I hear what you're saying, and there might not be a point to go over it again, but I don't agree. I don't. I hear what you're saying. I just don't see it as. I can't imagine how it could matter.
And it's just an argumentation.
Hmm.
It's not the justification, but
Hmm.
it is the rebuttal to somebody trying to hold you morally culpable for it,
Hmm.
because
Well,
it
yeah.
is
So if you're morally
true,
culpable
right?
of if you have a farm that uses pesticides and you could work towards having a farm that does not use pesticides, then you would probably it would probably be you'd be morally obligated to use the one that does not. It wouldn't be that you would say, well, using these pesticides is justified because I'm going to eat this food, and these
Right.
deaths would have happened anyways. So,
And this
so
goes
maybe
back
I do
to
get what you're saying and agree with
this,
you,
because
but we're
this,
wording it differently.
remember when we talked earlier about, like, I said that the vegan farmer would have to try to do as much veganic farming as possible, and then maybe society can handle up to 33% of farms being veganic, but the rest of the farms have to be these traditional pesticide sprayed farms for us to our species to be able to continue and survive. Well,
Hmm.
then we know that justification was built into that 66% of farms that does use pesticide, even though we know that it would be better if we could do more veganic farming. We just know that it's not practicable in that situation, right? So
Hmm.
if I'm the farmer just starting out, there's no other vegan farmers, and I become a farmer and I decide, hey, I want to do farming, well, then I am obligated to do it in a veganic way, if it's practical and possible to do so, despite the fact that I might not get a higher yield. uh, I would be obligated to that. But at a certain point, you're going to have if everybody became vegan, the obligation is going to shift a little bit, because you're probably going to recognize that, hey, veganic farming probably can't sustain 100% of all farming operations for the survival of society. I'm willing to bet that's the case. I don't know that for a fact. I mean,
Hmm.
I wish we could probably do veganic farming 100%, but I think if we really looked into it, we would find out that it would probably be not possible to do 100% veganic farming, but we could
Hmm.
probably get high up in the numbers there. So we do have to arrive at, you know, what is the most ethical, if we can help it. But getting there is going to be, you know, uh, until then, you're going to be held to the veganic farming standard, as a vegan. At a
Yeah.
certain point, that vegan farmer will probably have to be like, man, I'm not producing enough crops here to feed civilization. These
Hmm.
government agencies are telling me that we're going to have a food shortage. So I have no choice but to now start using pesticides to gain, 10%, 20% more yield. And, X amount of farmers have to do that for us to prevent a food shortage. That would be
Hmm.
a justification. right?
Yeah, no,
So
I completely get you on the justification. I'm not fully getting you. And maybe as I rewatch this conversation, I will catch something I missed. I am not gathering the the le- like, so for example, let's say I saved somebody that was going to be killed. Somebody was actually trying to kill somebody and I saved them. And then me and that person I saved and five other people go to an island and then we get stuck there. We're stuck there. And nobody's going to save us and we have to eat somebody. Like, because the person I saved was actually going to die if I didn't save them, it's not a justification, but it's whatever you said a second ago. That I should eat that person because they
so
were going to die anyways?
if you this is a little bit different of a situation because the it's like I said, that wasn't the justification. That was just the rebuttal to somebody trying to hold you morally culpable for the consequence of that death, right? So, for example, if we're
Yeah,
trying to
but
apply
and
this,
you think you shouldn't be held morally culpable, or it just makes you come across a little better while being
well,
morally
well, it
culpable?
would be different if like you say they criticized you and basically they were saying, well, hey, in the natural environment, one bee would have died, but since you, basically wiped out this farmland and sprayed the pesticide, well, now two bees died, right? Then
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't say, oh yeah, opportunity cost is that I saved more bees, so therefore your criticism is basically not, it doesn't hold the weight that you say it does. But if it does cause more deaths, then it does hold the weight that they say it does. So it's the weight that we're trying to account for or not account for, and whether or not you're culpable for something depends on how much that weighs, like how much damage and suffering did you cause or whatever your values that you're appealing to, right?
Mm-hmm.
um Sorry, yeah, go ahead. But
Gotcha. No, it's all right. I think that's probably a good point to stop on that one too. I
well,
just so
actually, I
do
thought of
you?
one other thing too on your
Okay.
island example here. So
Yeah, yeah.
one thing I like to consider on the island example is so if you know you're not going to survive, like that even if you eat the chicken you're probably going to die anyway,
Mm-hmm.
then you shouldn't eat the chicken. It's
Yeah.
only if you are going to survive that you're justified, right? It's obviously a decision you make in the moment. So
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to know whether or not you're going to die, but you can probably still estimate whether you're going to live or you're going to die. Like, does somebody know, hey, I'm stuck on this island and they might show up at any minute, or is this like I'm a totally stranded, lost, screwed individual? I have no chance, right? I think that's
Mm-hmm.
important to make that distinction too when you're deciding whether or not you have to eat another being to survive. Because if you are not actually going to survive, then you shouldn't make that call, to end
Yeah.
their life.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. Well, so I'm just curious then, if you were chatting with Avi or Vegan Gains or Lifting Vegan Logic, would you counter their stances on crop deaths not mattering because of the wildlife that was there before?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say that they're right in the sense of the criticism that they have against somebody trying to hold them culpable for that death is correct in the sense that they didn't actually cause more death, right? Because the problem people have with the action is not so much that the action is justified or unjustified. The problem they have is that the action is causing more death. It entailed in that is the consequence of more death. But
Mm-hmm.
if there's no actual consequence of more death, then that criticism is unfounded. And so the contention, the rebuttal that you have to that, somebody making that point is correct. But if you're talking about whether or not it's justified, then it's justified because it's necessary for your species to survive. So that's the only distinction I make. I don't know if they've made that distinction. I haven't really watched enough detail of their videos to see whether they've made that distinction, but they probably have made that
Yeah.
distinction.
Yeah, I don't know if they have, and I don't even know if I quite agree with it. I think I do. Honestly, there is a good chance that I'm just not fully understanding the detail. But yeah, I imagine something like
Well, let's say
If
let's say let's say let's say so you're in a situation with a bank robber again, right? And you
okay.
shoot the bank robber and you kill the person behind the bank robber. And then let's say, well, the bank robber was going to kill that same person had you not shot the bank robber, right? And
Hmm.
so basically somebody making the argument that says, hey, as a consequence of your action here, it resulted in this person unnecessarily dying. Well, in this hypothetical that basically that person was going to die anyway. So how can we
Hmm.
say that that is a fair criticism of the justification of killing the bank robber if we know that that person was going to die anyway? That's kind of, I think, what
Yeah,
the
but
opportunity cost point is all about, is dismissing the one death that happened as a result, even though
would it
it
be
was.
the same? Would it be the same if you saved that person from the bank robber, but everybody in the bank is locked in the bank for an amount of time that to survive they're going to have to eat somebody? Would it be most moral to eat the person you saved from death?
So say that again. So we're in a bank and
You're in a bank. There's a dozen
they're
people
locked
in
in
there,
there.
and
Okay.
the bank robber is about to shoot somebody. He says, "I'm going to shoot him." Lifts it up, goes to pull the trigger. You save the life of that person the bank robber was going to kill. Now, hopefully, you just get out of the bank and go live your life and be a good vegan. But you're stuck in this bank for enough time that everybody's going to die unless they eat a person. Is it safe to say that without any other knowledge of the other people when they were going to die, that that person you saved is the most moral person to, like, the most moral choice to eat?
So if it's a moral question, we would have to know those questions or those answers, right? Like if it, that's the thing about morality, is we're not going to always have those like facts at our disposal, so we just have to do what we do
So
know.
just facts aside, yeah, from what we do know, does that action that that person was going to die and didn't die makes their death matter differently?
And let me make sure I got this straight. So we're talking about the not the bank robber, but we're talking about the other person that we saved from the bank robber.
Yeah, a person that
If we
almost died
if
that was saved
if
who
we
would
turned
have
around
died.
and if we turn around and decided we had to eat them, what does it mean that the criticism levied against us for eating that person um, cannot be used as a the killing of that person from the bank robber would not be that would not be the justification, right? We
That would
wouldn't
not,
turn
yeah.
around.
The
That's
justification is
what
that you guys need to eat somebody, but is it more justified or more acceptable that you made that choice for that reason?
it's. I don't think it has a bearing on whether or not it's more justified or more acceptable. I think the bearing it has, the only time it's relevant is when somebody uses consequentialism to dictate that what you're seeing here is immoral because somebody died. Like the death alone is not exactly what is immoral about this situation. It's the act, so to speak, in my opinion.
Hmm.
Not that consequences like can't have immoral, implications on the act, but basically, if you're going through a situation and you're doing it for survival, and you are criticized for having to kill that person to survive, and I don't know, let's just say like uh, we went through the whole shebang where everybody like diplomatically got together and like had to make a decision on like who was going to die, and honestly, in somebody in that situation, it might be better for somebody to raise their hand and go, hey, I'm going to sacrifice myself. There might be a morally virtuous person in there willing to do that, which would kind of, that's besides the point. But
But
basically,
you
let's
don't,
say
you wouldn't
let's say
say
we
that you should say it's nice that you are willing to, but this person would have died, so they should die.
correct, right. That would not
Interesting.
be a justification. So the justification lands on your action, whether or not your action was you know um morally, like, was it correct or was it incorrect? Did it.
I definitely agree with you on that for sure.
But if somebody was like, basically, let's say they were going to, let's say we did kill this person, and then the same person who would have died, and then the news comes out later that says they actually, went through and cannibalized somebody to make it out of this bank, that they otherwise could not have made it out of had they not eaten this person, but basically are basically trying to say like, you know, you are responsible for that death, and
Mm-hmm.
then you say, well, technically that person would have died anyway. You know, it's not the justification that they would have died anyway. That's just a point on the side that says, hey, the weight of your moral claim is actually
It's
it.
just a good
You
defense
can't
for
use it.
yourself. Interesting. Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
I think I get that, and I think therefore you would stand against Avi and Vegan Gains and lifting vegan logic, because they tend to use it as a justification for crop deaths.
right.
So interesting. Yeah. Okay. Uh, sorry we got off on so many tangents. I actually do got to hop off here, but this was a great talk,
Yep,
and I look forward to all the ones that we've discussed having in the future as well.
certainly. Yep. All right. Well, we'll get more into this, I think, because
Y-
I do have more stuff for you, but we'll just play it by ear. So,
Yeah, yeah. Next
um,
time, since this time I kind of made it go completely all towards my initial question I had for you.
well, it
Let's
was an
go
important
ahead.
question. It was an
Yeah.
important question for you, so I wanted to make sure we had that answered. But I do have other stuff for you on this particular topic. So,
Yeah, yeah.
you
Next
know,
talk, it'll just be you started off and you throw the questions at me.
all right.
All right. Well, thanks for talking, and
Yep.
thanks everybody in the chat for watching. And I'll see you guys later.
See ya.
All right. Take care.